You're listening to Beyond the Sermon, the podcast of First Methodist Church in Collingswood, New Jersey. On our podcast, the goal is not just to share our sermons, but to go beyond the sermon and talk about what we're learning and what God is doing in us and in our community. The sermon you're about to listen to comes from our Fall 2024 series, A Heart Like His, Seeing the Heart of God in the Life of David. In this series, we're asking the question, what does it look like for us to be a people after God's own heart? You can find more information about our church at fumccollingswood.org. Thanks for listening.
Well, you don't have to be very old in life to realize that friendships are important to people, right? There's a lot of evidence, both research-wise and just anecdotally, that bears that out. There are sayings that describe this reality, right? We talk about people being guilty by association, or as 1 Corinthians 15:33 puts it, bad company corrupts good character. Or other people are known to say things like, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. Or that most people are the average of the 5 people that they spend the most amount of time with, right? The point is, it doesn't matter just what you do with your time. It matters who you do it with, who you spend your time with. But it's not just about who you're becoming. Good friends can also be a source of strength, right? In the midst of difficult times, they can make celebrations like we're having today even more meaningful. Good friends know us. They love us. They challenge us to be the best that we can be, and they allow us to do the same for them. You see, good friendships, they're not just one-sided. There's a mutuality to them. Both people reach out. Both people can share honestly. There's a give and take from both sides. Unfortunately, not all of our friendships look like that. It seems that in the world we live in today, those kinds of friendships are actually increasingly rare. But that doesn't mean that we don't still need them. Have you experienced that kind of friendship? Have you experienced the kind of friendship that would lay themselves down for you? The kind of friend that you could argue with or disagree with, but you know that your love and your commitment goes deeper than whatever issue got in between the two of you. The kind of friendship that you can reach out to about anything, either big or small. See, I think that's the kind of friendship that we see between David and Jonathan. Not just in the passage that Jeremy read for us this morning, but across David's story. Right? So I want to take a few minutes this morning to look at Jonathan and David's relationship, their friendship, but not just so we can learn about their friendship, but to see what it can teach us about the heart of God. Because I don't think we can experience this kind of faithful love apart from God, right? It's not that two people who aren't believers can't have that kind of friendship. I think they can, but it's only because humans are made in the image of a God who longs for relationship, who wants friendship with us. So let's look at Jonathan and David and this passage as we get started. And full acknowledgement this morning, I'm leapfrogging some things again rather than going straight through. And we're jumping over some very important developments in the story of David, like his battle with Goliath and the shift in Saul's attitude toward David. But I felt like this was the passage that we needed to look at today, and we'll come back to some of those other things next week and in the weeks to come. I figured David's story is probably familiar enough that I won't be spoiling too much of it by going a little bit out of order. Anyway, on to the passage. Chapter 20 that Jeremy read for us, or at least the first half that he read, begins with David going from the place where he was hiding out with Samuel. Remember, we talked about him last week. He was the prophet. He was hiding from Saul, and Saul came looking. And so David moved on to the next place, and he went to find Jonathan, right? He went to find his friend, to find out what was going on with Jonathan's father, Saul. Why was he trying to kill him? But David is convinced that Saul's not actually trying to kill David. Saul had sworn that to him. If we were to flip back to chapter 19, he said, surely as the Lord lives, no harm will come to David. But something had shifted in Saul and David's relationship. And Jonathan was unaware of just how wide that chasm between Saul and David had gotten. He was unaware of how much Saul's jealousy of David had increased. But David sees the situation for what it is. He sees that Saul has kept all of this from Jonathan because Saul recognized the depth of the relationship between David and his son. And so he intentionally kept his desires, his plans from Jonathan. So Jonathan asked David what he should do. How can he help? And David comes up with this plan to not only buy them some time, but to help Jonathan see exactly what was in the heart of Saul. David gives Jonathan this story that he's supposed to pass on to Saul when Saul realizes that David hasn't come to the feast like he was supposed to. And David told Jonathan, your father's response is going to tell you everything you need to know. But then David asks Jonathan to show him what the NIV calls here as kindness. And David points back to the covenant, the agreement that Jonathan had made with David, which was recorded in chapter 18. In chapter 18, beginning in verse 1, it says that after David had finished talking with Saul, this is following the death of Goliath, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. You see, the friendship that existed between David and Jonathan wasn't just a friendship. Jonathan, in getting to know David and seeing what was going on, Jonathan had come to recognize what David's anointing had meant. Because it meant something for both of them, right? It meant that David was going to be king following Saul, but that also meant that Jonathan was not, right? He wasn't going to be the king who succeeded his father Saul. Now, normally, we'd expect that to make enemies out of people, right? Not friends. But rather than allowing that to turn him against David, to see David as a rival who was claiming his throne, Jonathan got on board with what God was doing. And he made a covenant with God, not just in words, but with his actions, right? He took off his robe and his tunic, and he gave them to David. He took his sword and his belt and his bow, gave them to David. In essence, he was giving up his role as heir to the kingdom of Saul, his right to the throne of Israel, placing David in that role of the future king. And it was this siding with David that made Saul so angry. Right, that almost gets Jonathan killed. If we were to read a little further in chapter 20, after Jeremy left off, we'd find out that David does what he says he's going to do. He doesn't show up at the feast. Jonathan tells Saul the story, and Saul is furious. He asks what had happened. And Jonathan said, well, I gave him permission to go. And Saul got so angry, he threw a spear at his own son, trying to kill him, just like he had already tried to do with David. But this covenant that Jonathan made with David in chapter 18, this is the covenant that David's referring to in chapter 20 when he asks Jonathan to remember the covenant. And Jonathan commits. He said, I will follow that plan and communicate the results. And in his response, in 1 Samuel 20, verse 14, Jonathan asks David, likewise, to honor their covenant in the future, not knowing when or if they would ever see each other again. Right? So in 1 Samuel 20, verses 14 and 15, Jeremy read it for it, but we're going to read it again. And this is Jonathan speaking to David. He says, but show me unfailing kindness, like the Lord's kindness, as long as I live, so that I may not be killed. And do not ever cut off your kindness from my family, not only when the Lord has cut off, or not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth. And here I have a bit of an issue with the NIV translators, because they didn't fix a poor translation tradition that comes to us from the King James Version. Right, we've learned a lot since 1611, and a lot of the English language has changed. Right? But the NIV didn't take an opportunity to fix this. The Hebrew word that's translated here as kindness is the Hebrew word hesed. Okay? It's got a good hard H sound there at the front. Hesed. Go ahead and give it a shot. Hesed. In the King James Version, hesed is most commonly translated as mercy, or as here, as kindness. Sometimes even loving kindness. And there's certainly an aspect of mercy and kindness that's summed up in the word hesed. But they don't go far enough. They don't explain the fullness of this word. You see, hesed is the unfailing, faithful love of God. So, for instance, in Psalm 36, right, we get this recounting of how God has acted in the Israelites' history. And after every line that it says, every description that he rescued them from the hands of Pharaoh, we hear the refrain, his love endures forever. Right? Well, it's not just love, it's his hesed. His hesed endures forever. Or when God passed in front of Moses there on Mount Sinai, in the midst of that interaction that they're having up there, we hear God calling out, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in love, in chesed and faithfulness, maintaining love, again, chesed, to thousands, forgiving their wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Dr. Dennis Kinlaw puts it this way. He says, now for us, love is primarily and almost exclusively a word about feelings. Right? But the main truth about God is not that he feels certain ways. The main truth about God is that he is certain things, as revealed in how he acts. That is what is so significant about hesed. It is not about a way of feeling. It is about a way of acting. And when we discover that this is the way God always acts, that tells us about who he is. His hesed, his love, isn't just about mushy-gushy feelings we feel. It's about how God chooses to act, how we can choose to act. Now, I picked on the NIV and the King James a little bit, but I do think other translations do it a little bit better. If we were to open up an English Standard Version Bible, we would read Jonathan speaking. He said, "If I'm still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord." Or the New Living Translation says, "May you treat me with the faithful love of the Lord as long as I live. But if I die, treat my family with this faithful love." The Revised Standard Version says, "If I'm still alive, show me the loyal love of the Lord, that I may not die." See, there's definitely a sense of kindness and mercy there. But there's so much more to this faithful love of God. Jonathan isn't just asking David to be kind, to be nice to him and his family. He's asking that David would show them hesed, right? Faithful love, like the faithful love of the Lord, the hesed of Yahweh. Even after God has dealt with all of David's enemies. And David makes that covenant with Jonathan. He promises to show that kind of faithful love to Jonathan and to his family. And Scripture actually records how David kept that promise that he made to Jonathan. Right? Even after they talk here in the field that day, and they don't ever see each other again. At least not as far as we're told in Scripture. Jonathan goes back to Saul. David goes into the wilderness and into hiding from the king for years as Saul pursues him, as they face other enemies, Philistines, Amalekites, all these other people. And finally, one day Saul and Jonathan go into battle. And they're killed in battle. Jonathan never having seen David again. And if you were to read it in 2 Samuel chapter 1, you'd hear the depths of the grief that David expressed, not only over the loss of his friend and beloved Jonathan, but even over Saul, who David still held to be the king, the anointed one of Israel. But David's grieved over their falling. But then after David's kingdom was established, right, other battles were fought, other enemies were subdued. God took care of Israel's enemies. When David finally got a minute to sit down and begin to think, David remembered what he had promised to his dear friend Jonathan. Right, and he began to ask around if there was anyone remaining from the house of Saul to whom he could show hesed for Jonathan's sake. Eventually, they found a servant by the name of Ziba who had served in Saul's household, and they asked him the same question. Is there anyone still remaining from Saul's household to whom I can show hesed for the sake of Jonathan? The servant told David, well, yes, there's one son who is remaining. So David called for Jonathan's son, whose name was Mephibosheth. Anybody rushing to write that one down for your next birth certificate? Mephibosheth. David calls for Mephibosheth to come before him in the palace. And I'm speculating a little bit here, but I don't think too far. I can imagine that Mephibosheth was terrified to receive that summons. Right? On the one hand, he was the sole remaining heir of Saul, the sole descendant of Saul. He could easily have been seen by David as a threat to his throne. And according to worldly wisdom, David would want to eliminate that threat, right? The threat of rebellion that could be raised under the banner of Mephibosheth, grandson of Saul. On the other hand, Mephibosheth was disabled. He was vulnerable. 2 Samuel 4:4 tells us, Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news came that Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, the news that they had been killed in battle. The son's nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became disabled. His name was Mephibosheth. He couldn't walk. He needed help. So Mephibosheth comes to David, and he comes expecting the worst. But that's not what he finds. Instead of a death sentence, Mephibosheth experienced hesed. Right? Because David had experienced, he had come to know the faithful love of God. This is what Mephibosheth experienced when he came before David. 2 Samuel 9:7. "Do not be afraid," David said to him, which is why I think I'm not too far off. "Do not be afraid," David said to him, "for I will surely show you kindness. I will surely show you hesed, the faithful love of God. For the sake of your father Jonathan, I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Rather than coming to David and receiving that death sentence, Mephibosheth found hesed. He found a place at the table. See, Jonathan had showed faithful love to David, and he'd kept the covenant that he made with him to the very end. And David showed faithful love to Mephibosheth on behalf of his friend Jonathan. See, I think they understood that the intimate friendship that they shared didn't originate with them. It wasn't just good feelings within them. Their friendship found its source in the faithful love of God. See, it's the hesed of God that makes space for that kind of friendship, the kind of friendship that's closer than a brother or sister. But it's also not lost on me. On this Sunday, as we celebrate 50 years of the God's Special Children's Ministry, that God's hesed, the faithful love of the Lord, makes space for the Mephibosheths of the world, those who need a little more assistance, those with disabilities, those who maybe can't produce in the way that we so value in our American culture. But I'm so proud that for the last 50 years, this congregation has lived out the faithful love of the Lord to God's special children and their families, to the Mephibosheths of our world. But friends, it's not enough. It's not enough to pat ourselves on the back for 50 years of one ministry. You see, God is calling each of us to live out hesed. Each of us to live out his faithful love. Yes, to our friends. Yes, to our family. Yes, to those in our church who we're in covenant relationship with, but also to the least and to the lost. And for you, it may not mean serving in the GSC class, but it could. And I'm sure Joan or Carolyn or Eric would talk to you about those opportunities. But maybe it looks like serving in our nursery, or in our food pantry that we host here, or with Child Evangelism Fellowship and a Good News Club, or Young Lives, which is a ministry in our area that reaches out to teen parents, or in any number of other places. Remember, hesed The faithful love of God, it's not about our feeling toward something. It's about God's character revealed in how God acts. And it's about Him forming that character in us and in how we act. The reality that God has called us to live in, to live from, to live out is His faithful love given for the world. It's calling each of us to find our place in that, to respond to the hesed that we ourselves have experienced and to show it, to exhibit it in our lives to everyone we come in contact with.